What the hell? Let's do it.
That's the spirit. To quote the great Joseph Campbell, he said, "It is by going down into the abyss where we recover the treasures of life. Where you stumble, there lies your treasure." To the ironic twist of the unknown. Bottoms up.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Happy heresies and welcome to the desert of the real. Welcome everybody to Aeon Byte. Welcome you spiritual entrepreneurs, you Johnny Cash bodhisattvas, and you modern day Tom Sawyers, your mind not for rent to any god or government. My name is Miguel Connor and I am your Pompatus of Gnosis. And for those who are watching live on various video platforms, I am excited to welcome you on this Mercury Day, this day of Hermes. And Hermes was the god of language, the god of magic, the god of travels, the god of money. And boy, it's one big quantum entangled web. And I think the theme of this show will help you tap into the best of Hermes and hopefully separate the trickster from the logos, or maybe not. Maybe you just like the trickster and the logos to be always joined at the hip. That is your choice, because it's always you are the final authority and always are. We simply bring you this gnosis for you so you can make up your own damn mind, and hopefully it will lead you to more self-knowledge and a clearer path for your own sacred quest in this kenoma, this emptiness. So very excited today to be joined by Toby Chappell to discuss his new book, The Language of Magic, Transform Reality Through Words, Magical Symbols, and Sigils. Toby, thank you very much for coming on the show.
Great. Great to see both of you. It was really, well, I think the third that I can't see, but is really glad to be here. I'm looking forward to this very much.
Well, very excited too. Yeah, I really enjoyed your book, and we're certainly going to break it down. And with us too, we've got the Moondog Vance. Vance, how are you doing from sunny California?
Oh, it's sunny here still, and I'm doing fine after a long day. And I like the idea of semiotics, so I'm looking forward to seeing how that relates to magic and linguistics. That's I can see the connections there. I have an intuitive feel for it. I'm looking forward to learning about it.
Awesome. Yeah, you certainly will enjoy the book, and you will enjoy Toby's excellent research. And I see people in the chat. Good evening to everybody there. I hope you're having a good day. As always, please super chat if you have any questions so that Vance can get to them. Please support Aeon Byte as always. Like, subscribe, join the Patreon. Give me a one-time donation, crypto or whatever. All this, yeah, speaking of magic, all this fake thing we call money that seems to be created and disappearing in these last few days and these last few years. Talk about the grand illusion, as Styx would call it. But yes, please support Aeon Byte in any way you can. Yes, I'm excited too, Toby, because my book was released yesterday, same as your book. So, and from
Great.
Destiny Books. So we're kind of twins, and I hope both of our books really move the needle. And again, love Inner Traditions and the work they're putting out. They just put a variety of work from different ideologies and traditions. So yes, everybody, if you didn't know, yes, the Occult Elvis is out. And it came out the same day as this excellent book, too. So a lot of magic in the air for you to tap into. So let's get to it. The first, maybe tell the audience a little bit about yourself, Toby, and how you came to grab this book from the ether. as I like to say, you know, as Carl Jung said, ideas have you. We don't have ideas.
So my name is Toby Chappell. I'm I guess you'd call an independent researcher at the moment, who's very interested in things like language and semiotics and how they affect the way that we both perceive and shape reality. Goes much further than magic. Magic is one facet of how one uses those tools to shape reality, but it's a very important one. And your earlier comments about the virtuality of money, there are two things that people regularly use that are very abstract and technically non-existent things without even thinking about them: money and language.
Mhm.
Um, that they've become so commonplace, for things that were not always commonplace, that we don't usually think about it. They just become part of the background of what we work with. But I've always been very interested in language. I've studied different languages, studied the phenomena of language itself, independent of specific languages. And this book has been kind of building in a way for 30 years at this point, going back to kind of what really originally grabbed me about language, taking several years of Latin in high school from, even though it was a public school in, a very unremarkable part of middle Georgia, the Latin teacher had a PhD. He was a classics scholar. He was very, very astute man, very externally funny man. He was such a popular teacher that um, for a high school Latin class, there was a wait list. You couldn't get into his class unless you went through the process of working your way
Wow.
through the role, just because of the magnetism of the man, but also the magnetism of what he taught and the passion that was clear in the way that he taught it. And that really rubbed off on me. That really made a very strong impression on me, and it stuck with me, such that he's even included as one of the dedications in this book, in debt to that critical opening of my mind towards certain things. Um, this is my second book. My first book, Infernal Geometry and the Left-Hand Path, came out 6 years ago, also in Intertraditions.
Hmm.
And that was looking at a very specific type of magic, born out of very specific tradition, but also even there drawing from things like the fiction of H.P. Lovecraft, the number mysticism of Pythagoras, and so on. The languages of magic is much broader because the phenomenon of language affects all of us. Anyone who has the opportunity to acquire language does so. It's something we do without even thinking about it. We're just hardwired to do it, and so it pervades our lives in such a way that, in my view, and I talk about this quite a bit in the book, anything that lets us be more ourselves, lets us understand the world in new and better ways, becomes ripe for magic. It becomes ripe for being able to be used to affect the world because it's part of our perception of the world. If we perceive the world in one way, we can then work with those
Right.
perceptions and alter them. But that's been kind of a recurring theme throughout most of my life, just a fascination. So I think it's inevitable at some point that this book came to be written.
Yeah, I'm glad it is because it's an excellent odyssey on the idea of language and magic and again, sigils, symbols and signs and all that. And it really goes to the heart of how we experience reality can actually alter reality. So we want to get into that, but I guess some of the questions, and I know I'm going to use that my dad joke. I don't say $1 million question. I say egg carton question because it's expensive. But what is magic? I think that's something we have to agree. And in my book, I do, I call Elvis America's greatest magician, but I spend some time trying to offer different variations of magic. And that's another thing we share, Toby, is that we both quote Don Webb in our books, because I quote Don and his ideas of Goetia and all that. But then I also bring in, Crowley, Dion Fortune, John Michael Greer, Gordon White, and I offer all these definitions of magic so that the reader can have, can understand what magic is. What is magic to you, or in the context of your book?
Sure. Magic is one of those words. It's really kind of problematic in a sense because it means
Yeah.
so many different things to so many different people. And one thing that authors will sometimes do on purpose and sometimes just without thinking about it, they will decline to say what they mean by magic within a given situation. Whereas I find that because I value precision and I value um, a an honest relationship with the material that I'm writing, I find it very important to offer definitions. And I stress when I offer a definition of magic in the book, I stress that this is not the only way to look at magic. This is one specific way,
Of course.
but this is the way that I'm looking at it within this context. And I think that that's very important. That's a lesson that I learned from one of my teachers, Stephen Flowers, that
Mhm.
you have to work with precision within ideas in order to really unfold what they're really about. Because if you just bring your own biases, your own misconceptions, your own hopes to something and ignore what it could really be within a specific situation, a specific context, then you're going to miss out on some of what you're trying to do. Um, so the definition that I offer in the book, it's a bit inspired, I guess, ultimately by Crowley, but is not Crowley's definition cast anew. It's really my own. Is that magic is working with the symbols that allow us to perceive and affect reality in a non-causal way in order to bring about certain changes. And I
Mhm.
emphasize, and this is sort of my debt to Don Webb as well, there, I emphasize that the most important change you can make is to yourself. Because in order to have certain effects within the world outside yourself, you need to become the kind of person that can create those changes in the world. And so magic is ultimately about, to me at least, is ultimately about working on the self. And one of the ways that you know that you've had some level of success in that is that it will then bring you new ways to affect magic within the world beyond yourself.
Great. Yeah, great definition. Works for me. And so you would say, for example, that the sort of reductionistic Alan Moore definition of magic, which is basically equating magic to language, really doesn't work. And other writers have done it, Neil Gaiman. It's
Mhm.
very simple. Or John Michael Greer, who just associated more or less with just good marketing. Even Giordano Bruno said, mass marketing is magic. You would disagree with that point of view, or where do you
Oh,
stand?
yeah, I would not take it as far as they do, is the way I would put it. I spend a lot of time talking about that a lot of times we're better served by actually discarding the word magic and working with something that's more precise to the task at hand and to the concept at hand. For example, I work with the term that I prefer myself is semiurgy.
Mhm.
From Greek roots means sort of magic with signs or creating change through signs. Now, that was a coinage by the French philosopher Jean Baudrillard, who was
Mhm.
a semiotician par excellence.
Mhm.
And he was primarily concerned with the creation of signs, how we create signs that carry certain meanings forward into the world. And I take that a bit further and say that it's not just that, it's also those processes by which the world is changed through the signs that we use to describe it and the signs that we use to carry our intent into the world. Um, Now, that being said, for someone like Alan Moore, who is, is a long-standing, long-time magician and is
Mhm.
someone who obviously has a great deal of facility with words, I certainly think that for him, that is an equation that makes sense and that says everything that he needs to say about both language and magic. The
Mhm.
catch is if you're someone who's not Alan Moore and just pick that up as like a mantra or like a slogan, you're probably going
Right.
to miss something about what that is, because it's not that those um, were always the same in his understanding. It was that he arrived at that understanding. He's
Right.
spoken about the way that he sort of realized that he was a magician when he noticed that he had said certain things in some of his graphic novels, and realized that if that they were reflecting his own thoughts and not just what he created for the characters that were saying them. And it made him realize that if that was really what he thought, then what else could he describe himself as but a magician? And so you have to kind of if you start from language as magic, then you're going to be stuck in what you can see that that can show you, what the language part can show you versus what the magic part can show you. If over periods of study and periods of practice, you arrive at those as a unity for yourself and your own perception of magic, then that has a lot more value than starting from that single point and trying to move out from it, I think. So
No, that
I would say that for myself, that's not the optimal definition, but I believe that for Alan Moore that it would be.
no, that makes sense. Yeah, interesting. You're talking about he was writing it and he saw things because that perhaps is where the magic happens. Because on the other hand, you've got Grant Morrison who wrote The Invisibles as one long sigil. But what happened, if you've heard the story, is what happened to King Maud in the graphic novel happened. The same exact thing happened to Grant Morrison in real life. The same disease and accident that happened to one of the protagonists. So this one is where the language and the magic certainly were working together, and the whole sigil symbolism really came alive, don't you think, Toby?
Oh, for sure. I mean, for someone that has a great deal of skill in successfully casting change through magic out into the world, you may often find that if you put enough intent out there, that at some point that intent kind of comes back comes back to you, and sometimes not always in unexpected ways. That's one of the wonderful things about magic is magic is not a guarantee that something's going to happen. Magic tilts the scale somewhat.
Yeah.
And as a result of that, there's always an element of the unknown about it. There's always a bit of mystery that you never know exactly what will turn out from it. But you have to be prepared to deal with that as well, because, like it or not, that was part of what you cast out in the world, even if it was not what you originally intended.
Yeah, well said. Yeah, it's about probabilities, as someone once widely said.
Yeah.
It might
Yeah.
happen,
Which
it might
is,
not happen.
yeah. Well, and that's why I draw such a parallel between semiotics and magic, while not conflating them and insisting that they're the same thing. Is because if you study just a hardcore text about semiotics, let's say for example the works of Roland Barthes, his mythologies is extraordinarily entertaining, but it's also very profound in the way that he looks at how the symbols that we use to carry ideas have permeated, especially our modern lives. Um, and what you see there is that if you take, for example, the use of semiotics within advertising to smuggle, as it were, certain ideas along with the overt symbol that you see, but the idea that's coming along with it that is somehow related to what they want you to buy.
Mhm.
Again, they're not. No one's showing up and putting the gun to your head and saying buy this brand of soap or else. But what they are doing is they're smuggling in that idea along with other symbols that you accept the surface level, but now it comes with these other things you may not have noticed, and it predisposes you to think in certain ways by making certain connections between the elements of those signs. But then you always have to ask yourself what else is coming along with this at the same time, and uh, that is magic in a sense, because it's not strictly a matter of cause and effect. But it is it's a tool that magicians can use. When a magician uses that, they bring something else to it as well. They're bringing this magical mindset to it that isn't there. I don't go as far as some do of saying that, advertisers are magicians. Well,
Mhm.
because they're not thinking like magicians. They're not acting as magicians. They're not thinking of what they do as magic. In order to be a magician, you need to think of yourself as doing magic, I think, first and foremost.
Mhm.
But there's also the magical mindset that you bring to something like that, where you're aware that you are attempting to alter your perception or the perception of someone else through magic, and you are bringing certain symbols into it that maybe someone who is not a magician would not bring into them. You think about the trappings of whatever system of magic you may happen to practice. Um, that thinking like a magician is part of what's necessary to be a magician, not just doing magical things, I would say.
What about movements or ideologies like New Thought, manifestation,
Mhm.
positive thinking? Would you put those under the magic rubric?
Not precisely, although there's a lot of magical thinking in the way those are approached.
Mhm.
There was a chapter that I was originally intending to write for the languages of magic, but I had to cut it because of both space considerations, also time considerations. I was under a moderately tight deadline, and that chapter was going to be to look at things exactly like what you're talking about there, and even take it further into things like NLP, general semantics,
Right.
and even broader things like word clearing and Scientology, things that are magic adjacent. And oftentimes, like in the case of NLP, are things that can be incorporated into magic. And the intent there was going to be not to say, okay, these things are not magic, but it wasn't to to denigrate them or anything like that. But what I wanted to look at was um, flaws in their theories that prevent them from being fully magic with signs and magic with
Mhm.
words. Um, for example, with general semantics, one which has certain value as a conceptual tool, but some of their claims, many of their claims are not able to be substantiated by actual a cognitive science. All
Mhm.
right, and that doesn't, to me, that doesn't invalidate them entirely. It means, all right, well, we can't say that this has power because it corresponds to some aspect of our anatomy, but it could still have power in the sense that it still can affect your thoughts in certain ways. It still can affect the way that you approach magic, and that has value. Conceptual models are more about, is this useful, than is it true in any sort of objective sense. So I don't write off something just because it's not, verified by science. Otherwise, I wouldn't be a magician. Um, uh, but that was going to be an interesting area to look into to see why is this not as effective as they want it to be, or as maybe they think that it is.
Yeah, indeed.
Like for example, with positive thinking, that's actually a fun one. With was Emile Q and his every day in every way I'm getting better, I think was the way it's normally translated. The idea that you say this often enough that you say it till it becomes true. That sort of idea. Well, the catch is you're that's missing a couple of things that you need linguistically. One is just saying the same phrase over and over again has certain value. I mean, this is a mantras. We know that mantras
Yeah.
have a very quantifiable value. But the thing about something like that you repeat it again and again is it gradually loses meaning. It becomes less about the meaning behind it and more about the effect that it has on this repetition of the same sounds again and again. So saying that the more you say it, the more you would internalize the concept, it actually doesn't work in practice because that's not how our minds process language.
Mhm.
Um, and as well as the everyday in every way I'm getting better, that that's goalless. It doesn't have a specific goal. What does
Mhm.
better mean? Right? What does it mean? Does it have a consistent meaning for you from day to day? And things like that. It was an interesting one I thought to start to look at because it on the surface it looks to be kind of in line with some of what I talk about in the book about the way that words can convey something different and new about reality and the way we put them out there. Um,
Right.
but uh, but that is missing something at the same time. So that may be something that I still write in some form, a blog post or something like that to put out there. Um,
Definitely, definitely. And I guess some of the audience might be wondering a word you've used, and that's semiotics, that Vance is also interested. Maybe could you explain to the audience what are semiotics and in relation to language and magic?
sure. So semiotics is the study of signs, and what a sign is in that context is a sign is anything that refers to something else. It could be that calls up some image to your mind. It could be that it um, points to something else, like a footprint in the snow. It could be um, a something that resembles something else, like a stick figure that resembles a person. Um, so I want to stress that with signs that there is not just visual. It's not just visual, and it's not just words. It can be
Hmm.
both. I mean, words basically are signs in that sense. And what what signs do is as I said, they point to something else. Their object is the term that's often used. The object of a sign. For example, if I hear if I'm preparing for a magical working and the bell is wrong, for example. Well, the sound that I hear from the bell, that is an indexical sign that points to the bell, that calls my attention to the fact that there's a bell over there. That doesn't say anything about what the bell means, right? Because that, what a bell can mean is going to be different. It could be the dinner bell that it's time to come to dinner. It could be the school bell that says class is over. Different, even if the sounds are the same, they mean different things in different contexts.
Right.
In the context of a magical ritual, for example, depending on your tradition and your practices and the associations that you may bring to it, that could mean the sound itself could have significance, that it's cleansing the space in some way. The number of times that you ring the bell can have significance. That's a different kind of sign. That's a symbolic sign. So symbols are where it gets really interesting for magic. Just to complete the trifecta there, an icon is a sign that's in some way resembles the thing that it evokes. Think like a photograph resembles the thing that it's a picture of, a stick figure. It doesn't have to be a good correspondence. It just has to be enough to give you the sense of what that thing is. But symbols are where it gets really interesting, I think. Now, the thing to understand with semiotics is that, in effect, language is a subset of semiotics. Words, whether written, spoken, gestured, are a specific kind of sign. For example, the word tree refers to that particular living thing. In the English language, in a different language, that combination of sounds may mean nothing or may mean something else entirely. And when you're working with symbols, there's always both meaning that has been conventionalized, meaning that most people would understand this to somehow be the meaning of the sign. But there's always your own personal meaning, born from your experiences, your point of view, your desires, etc. So symbolic signs are always kind of partially within us and beyond us. There's always something we bring to it. There's always going to be some association with that only belongs to you because it only matches to your experience. Even if your understanding of a particular symbolic sign may be largely the same as what someone else with the same training or the same background might think of it. But that's also part of how we create communities, in a sense, around signs, linguistic communities, people that use words in certain ways. If you think about the way that you might have talked to your grandparents versus the way you talk to your friends when you were a kid, you would say different things. You would use words that are meaningful in this context, not in this context. It's the same thing with magical schools. There are words we use within the Temple of Set in certain ways that, if you're not part of the Temple of Set or not read about it, you might not understand them to mean the same thing. So words, signs in general, but words especially, become parts of our identity, become parts of who we think we are. Now, as far as how this relates into magic, so let's go back to the idea of the bell. There'll be maybe certain associations you bring to that as part of the opening or the closing of a magical working. And you're overloading the conventional meaning of that, which is just a thing that you tap with a hammer and it makes a certain sound. You're overloading that to have this additional meaning within this context that maybe it doesn't have that meaning elsewhere. And this starts to kind of open the gate toward symbols and magic. Because everything that you do is part of a working of magic. Everything that you have with you as part of it, or as maybe as part of your dress or part of the words that you use, etc., become symbols that have meaning within that context that you're using to construct your idea of what you want to come about. So you may add you may have some symbols you use in virtually any act of magic, and then other symbols that you bring that are specific to the thing you want to have happen. To take like a very sort of mundane example, if you're doing like a working some type of money magic, you may have a dollar bill that you use in there. It's still a dollar bill. It's still made out of the paper and all that, but it means something else right then that it doesn't mean when it's just sitting in your wallet or when you're handing it over at Starbucks. So we bring all of these associations, both the ones that are parts of our experience, but also parts of our desires, to the symbols that we work with, and we use them as part of the language to describe to the unmanifest what it is we are attempting to do. what it is that we want to bring about through magic. So just like we're using words to convey certain ideas, and which are going to be necessarily imperfect in the transmission, the words that I use maybe don't convey every single bit of meaning that I'm thinking of when I say them, but they get close enough that you understand what I'm talking about.
Right.
It's the same thing with magic. You are engaging in communication with the phenomenon you're attempting to create or affect, and the extent to which the the extent to which you communicate that intent with clarity and with the right intent is going to have a influence on whether or not it comes out the way that you want it to come out.
Makes sense. Well, Vince, what do you think? Questions from you or the audience so far? I see Graham is saying he loves semiotics. It's like I've known him for
Yes.
15 years. I didn't even know that. We men never share. We never share with each other.
Too busy talking to our guests, right?
Yeah.
Well, I'm still a little bit foggy on the definition of magic we're talking about today, but I'll ask this question. What, if any, is the difference between the universe as conceived by a magician and the universe as conceived by just a materialist scientist? What are the significant differences in the model of the universe?
So, in a purely mechanistic and materialist worldview, what you typically see that goes with that, and even within materialism, there's variation. Different people look at it in different ways, because you can always argue what is the material that everything is made out of. Even
Yeah.
if you say that's all material, well, what does that mean? But what will typically go with that is this idea that there's an unbroken chain of cause and effect from whatever beginning we happen to work with or think may have happened, Big Bang or something else, to the present, and that there's a determinism in the way that events unfold. That sort of the idea that everything that happens can be explained somehow by the laws of physics. Essentially.
Okay.
Okay. When I contrast that with a magical view, what I see is that there is more at play than just direct cause and effect. That there is, looking at this as a semiotician, a collection of signs. Like, for example, we're talking about the signs that may accompany a ritual magic activity, right? We would refer to those as a network of signs or a web of signs. The idea that they're interconnected, that they're not entirely, it's not, 9 different things that are not connected. It's 9 different things that have some interrelations. For example, they may be related by the order in which you do them. They may be related by, these 2 things need to be the same color, depending on what your tradition is, etc. And the semiotician's view of the world is that there is an unlimited number of sign networks that are at play. Different signs that have different associations and that different connections, that make up what we call codes. If you think about, for example, a code would be something like the behaviors around eating in most of the West. The idea that you do it at certain times and that you use a fork for most things, and only certain things you're allowed to eat with your hands, and that there are certain foods that you do and don't eat. There are certain behaviors that you were supposed to engage in or not engage in as part of having a meal with others. And the thing about codes, semiotic codes, is that you don't notice them as long as everyone is playing along. You don't, like, if you're at the dinner table, you're not looking around at everyone going, constantly checking that they're all using a fork, using the right fork on their salad or whatever. But the second someone reaches into the mashed potatoes and just scoops it up, you notice, right? So we notice it because someone broke the code, someone went against the code. So
Well,
we always
etiquette.
have these
Yeah.
we always have these overlapping and competing codes. If you think about something as complex like as culture, with all the different codes that around you do this in this situation, this in this situation, and then what happens when you have people that have different ideas about what you should be doing that coincide? They're trying to figure out, well, what's the right behavior. You may misinterpret what someone does because they thought they're doing what their code suggested they should do, not what yours, etc. Um, and when you look at that in terms of this constant mix of interrelated signs that we navigate as part of working within the world, what you see is that there's too much going on to say this and this and this happened in exactly this order, and that precisely explains what just happened.
Mhm.
Because humans are limited in the amount of information they can work with at a single time. We are limited in terms of our perception. Humans can only hear and see within certain frequency ranges, and so forth. So there's a lot that's non-deterministic about the way that humans work. Humans are not always rational. Humans don't always do things for rational reasons. We you walk across, we play the lottery, whether it's like you go down to the 7-Eleven and fork over a few bucks, or you play the lottery by crossing the busy street in Manhattan.
Yeah.
We don't always behave in ways that make sense, even to us, right? Um, and so that kind of flies in the face of that everything is deterministic idea. And we can get into long discussions around free will and all that sort of thing as well. But contrasting those two worldviews. Now, bringing in the magician's point of view, all right. Well, the magician's point of view, the idea, one of the hallmarks of magical thinking is this idea that there is not a strict cause and effect that's happening. You may say and do certain things that, in a magical sense, that um, that push reality toward what you want it to be, but there's never that guarantee. The idea that if I always repeat these precise things in this precise order and I'll receive this precise result, now you're back into science again. You're back
Mhm.
into a purely rational, mechanistic worldview, in my opinion. And even if you talk to the average person that maybe doesn't consider themselves a magician, you will still find magical thinking. For example, if anyone has ever tried to crank the car in a cold morning and it's not quite going, you're like, oh, come on, please, please, please crank, please crank, please crank, and then one more time, and now it turns on. That's magical thinking. You probably did not really. I'm not going to say definitely not, but you probably did not cause it to crank just by pleading hard enough. Maybe you're a better magician than I am, and be able to pull it off. But that's something that seems to be baked in the way humans think. If you watch young children who are learning language, which we learn at the same time we're learning to navigate the world, there's a very close connection between movement and learning how to reach out and touch things and reach how to interact with things. That is closely connected with language, because we're learning language at the same time. We're learning how
Mhm.
language affects the world at that same time. But if you watch young children before they've started to receive a scientific education, which I definitely do not mean to denigrate science. I believe very strongly in science, but I also believe very strongly that science has certain places, and there's some things that science cannot do. And until someone can show me a formula of why the sunset is beautiful, then I refuse to believe that science can explain everything about the human experience.
Agreed.
Right. But children, the natural mode of children seems to be this magical thinking. That's that idea that if I wish hard enough, it happens. The magic of the tooth fairy. That was real to the child. Even if you set the child down and explain, yeah, well, Daddy really put it on there. Sorry to break your to break the bubble for you, kid. They're still going to believe there's like, well, maybe the tooth fairy helped you. Maybe the tooth fairies who lifted the pillow up to do it, right? Right.
So prayer is a form of magic, really, and magical thinking for sure.
In that sense, yeah, I think that it is. It's a form of conversation with whatever form of deity that you work with. Now, the catch there is in most people's conception, especially those that include prayer. And again, it's hard to. I try to avoid universals in the discussion of magic, but for most people that include our prayer as part of their practices, there tends to be a bit of an uneven relationship with their deity. It's that my job is to ask you, your job is to help if you want to help, right? Personally, I prefer a not equal, because otherwise there would not be differentiate between gods and men, but but a a more balanced relationship, I would say, more of a conversation than a one way. This is what I would like to have happen, um, or this is what I would prefer that you make happen, type of conversation. Um, but but I think that there's that type of magical. There's some level of magical thinking that is part of what it means to be human, and I think sometimes we forget that because we go too far into scientism and extrapolating science out to be able to explain everything when there are some things that clearly science cannot explain, and not just because we've not done enough experiments yet.
Yeah, well, imagination sounds like it's very key to the magical thinking. You have to, because
Abs-
in these cases, you got to imagine the deity, imagine the demon that you're invoking if you're doing that
well,
kind of magic.
if you want to change something about yourself, you first have to imagine that it can be other than it is
That
right now.
that too, right?
Right.
That's the concept of a hyperstition, isn't it? That you bring in your
Um,
book.
on a small scale, yeah, I would say that. Because every hyperstition was fiction until it wasn't,
Hmm.
right? For those
Like
who
Grant
are not
Morrison
familiar, because
again.
it's a term that's not super well known yet, although it's becoming a bit more known. A
I think it should
hyperstition
be.
it's sort of related to the idea of a superstition, but it takes it kind of a level further.
Hmm.
Hence the hyper versus super. But what a hyperstition is normally used to refer to is it's a large scale idea that um, that eventually sort of creates its own being by taking root in enough minds. Sort of my go-to example, one of the go-to examples for that is the idea of space travel. From the moment we realize that, wait, the moon and the stars are beyond the Earth in some way. They're not just part of like a dome that's on part of it. That
Hmm.
aspiration that what if we could somehow travel to those things? I can travel across the ocean. I can travel across the river. Why can't I travel from here to there?
Right.
and and then eventually is that because that's been a deep idea in human thought for a long time, even though it's only really become something that's feasible to some degree within the 20th century. um, but the thing is, um, because it became such a pervasive idea, such an aspiration that so many people wanted, directly and indirectly, eventually enough other things changed as a result of, sometimes directly related to that, sometimes not, that facilitate it. If you think about the economic changes that needed to happen, the changes in understanding of science and physics, political changes, you think about like the space race in the 60s, and where would it have even happened without Russia as the thing driving the US toward it,
Right.
that is one example. Um, but yeah, I think hyperstition has a lot of relevance to magic, from that very idea that in order to aspire to something that's different from the current situation, you have to first imagine that it could happen, and then you have to You can't always go directly from here to there. Sometimes you have to make other changes in order to build. You build it higher and higher until you can now reach high enough up.
But don't you bring in Lovecraft as a perfect example of hyperstition becoming magical?
Absolutely. Uh, you know, Lovecraft is an interesting. I mean, he's fascinating and interesting in so many ways. But
Yeah.
as looking at Lovecraft from the magician's perspective, I mean, you first have to come to grips with the fact that Lovecraft was very dismissive of magic and very dismissive of magicians. He said pretty dismissive and uncomplimentary, even vicious things about people like Crowley, who he was aware of.
And
Part of that was because
Theosophy borrowed from Theosophy big time. That's
Mhm.
ironic.
Right. Well, and that's the ironic thing in a sense, because Lovecraft, his personal philosophy was a very strictly materialistic,
Right.
deterministic idea. But what Lovecraft did was he was very aware of the power of his dreams. And so many of his stories were related to his dreams. They either came to him in dreams or they
Mm.
reflected dreams, or so many stories are about dreams. Even like the character of Randolph Carter. Whenever Randolph Carter shows up in Lovecraft, that is Lovecraft injecting him into the story, himself into the story.
Mhm.
Like with Lovecraft, the idea of hyperstitions, like you have the Necronomicon. It doesn't. It begins as this fictional creation in his works, and then it starts to be used by other writers. Starts to show up in their works, and enough that people reading his stories would, even if it just showed up in his book, they would think, oh, he made this up. It starts to show up in other writers, and you're like, well, hang on a second, is this thing real? And he even dropped hints around, well, he made up a history for it, and even hinted, well, that the library at Harvard has a copy under lock and key that they're not even allowed to admit that it's there. And then you have, by the 1960s, you have someone sneaking in a card into the library, into the card catalog, entry for the Necronomicon at Harvard. I'm sure the first librarian that had that card presented to him and said, "Hi, can you retrieve this from the stacks, please?" Probably had a really bizarre
Right.
experience. And then, of course, it turns into, and now there are actual Necronomicons out there, whether they are the
Yeah.
Necronomicon from Lovecraft.
Simon Magus, and
Mhm.
Simon, and of course
Right.
Kenneth Grant and his Typhonian Gnosis, or that's what you call it. Yeah, when you mix the Lima and Lovecraft, you just go right back to the Gnostics. That's what cracks me up. And we go to, again, Grant Morrison and his graphic novel Nameless, which is about, again, this sort of Typhonian, Lovecraftian, Gnostic thing. So, yeah, it did come real. It keeps coming real, even in movies.
Yeah. Well, and Lovecraft was a very central figure in my first book, Infernal Geometry and the Left-Hand Path, because inspired by Lovecraft, Michael Aquino and Anton LaVey had both included some work that sort of made actual magic practices out of Lovecraftian ideas. LaVey, ever the sort of trickster, added certain things to Aquino's description to suggest, like, no, this was really, Lovecraft really did this. He just didn't want to talk about it. It's like, nah, that's not true. But um, but the power is there. That hyperstitional power is there to allow it to become real. When the people that are capable of taking those ideas and synthesizing them and adding their own ideas to them, to create something new out of it. For example, Michael Aquino's work called The Ceremony of the Nine Angles, which has nothing to do with those people that use that as part of their name. They have nothing to do with it. But The Ceremony of the Nine Angles it combined Pythagorean number mysticism, the ideas of the monad and the dyad and so forth, up to the decad. Combined it with Lovecraftian magic ideas, and combined it with Lovecraft's kind of embellished descriptions of like the witch's Sabbat and things like that from Margaret Murray's The Witch Cult in Eastern Europe, Western Europe, etc., and turned it into an actual thing. Would that have been something that Lovecraft would have been in favor of? No, almost certainly not. But the power of fiction is such that if you're doing magic, you're already working with fiction in a sense, because you had some fictional version of reality that you're attempting to create. So you're already dialed into fiction just by doing magic. Now, where it gets interesting is, does your magic remain fiction, or does it now become something that takes on reality? Because even ideas like that they already have a reality if you've conceptualized them. They've not yet become actual within the world, but they have a reality. You can talk about it, you can be inspired by it, you can share it with others, and you share alternative versions of what could be with enough people, and then eventually they will start to work toward it.
Yeah, I wonder if it's some sort of, we call it today the Mandela effect or retrocausation. Because the other great example I think of is Robert Anton Wilson and Robert Shea, when they're dismissing these conspiracies and adding more stuff, and all of a sudden they're like, holy mother of God, these are true. You could say that's sort of a hyperstition that got out of hand with those two.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, some of that's the power of very effective storytelling. Some of it is the fact that Wilson was a magician in a sense. He was later embraced by the chaos magic movement, etc. He was a very big fan of William Burroughs' work, and Burroughs was a magician. Burroughs at one point joined the IoT, the Chaos Magic Organization. Was very much a magician writing fiction.
Mhm.
And you have that's a long tradition. You have that with people like W.B. Yeats and Arthur Machen and Fritz Leiber, people like that, Dion Fortune, et cetera, that practicing magicians who use that as part of their fiction, to give it a deeper reality, more visceral aspects. But the reverse works as well. Like I was saying with Lovecraft, is someone who's not a magician but depicts magic in a certain way within his works. Those ideas can be taken by actual magicians and then transformed into something that does work, that does have a viable magical theory behind it, does have signs and symbols that that knit it together into a viable form of magic.
Yeah, that's extremely well said, and somebody that also you bring up in your book, and to me is the great cautionary tale of both when I decide to suspend my disbelief and get really conspiracy minded, but also how something can come true. And that's Umberto Eco's Falcom's Pendulum. That book haunts me, and it's like my conscience on one side, right? It's tell us about Umberto Eco and his ideas on language and the warnings, how we can shoehorn anything. What's his famous example? I could find the Kabbalistic tree of life in a car engine if I really tried. You know what I mean? You can make anything into something.
Right. Oh, and Umberto Eco is fantastic. He's most well known to the wider world for books like Foucault's Pendulum and The Name of the Rose. Fantastic works. He's a fantastic writer. But he was also a professor of semiotics at the University of Bologna in Italy, and had very interesting theories about semiotics. I talk about this in the book. I love his definition. His definition, which captures the playfulness that Eco would bring to things, but also there's a depth to it as well. His conception of a sign is anything that can be used to lie. If you can convey some amount of truth with something, then that entails that you can also convey some amount of lying with it, that it can be falsified, that it can be negated, right? And again, that kind of plays against the more kind of mechanistic, deterministic universe, by saying that it's two things at once. It's not just it's not one thing that conveys an idea in the positive. It can also conveys an idea in the negative as well. Because any sign can falsely point to something. I could you could be what was the guy's name that created the oversized bird feet and then like trekked them on the beach for decades without telling anybody, and people thought that there's this cryptid giant bird out there somewhere, and then later this guy made these feet. He was just messing with right. So like that's a sign. It pointed to, well, something made this impression in the sand. But then when you try to determine what is it that made this impression, you're misled. You were lied to by the sign. The sign pointed to something that didn't actually exist. Well, it didn't actually exist as a real animal. It existed as a set of appendages that he could use to make this these impressions in the sand. And so there's a very semiotic flavor that pops up in Eco's works, most prominently in Foucault's Pendulum. To a lesser extent in Name of the Rose, people often mention that as his semiotic work, but it's really not. It really is working with more an idea from the semiotician Charles Sanders Peirce called abduction, as a contrast to deduction and induction as types of logical inference. Peirce was the one that came up with this triad of icon, index, symbol, and a few other triads related to semiotics. I talk about him quite a bit in the book. But his idea of abduction was part of how Peirce explained how you infer things. How you have he didn't believe that intuition was a real thing. He believed that there was some level of connecting ideas that was happening just maybe too quickly or too implicitly for you to understand where it came from. And key to that was abduction, which is a way of deciding inferences to go test as part of whether the scientific method or as part of detection, as it happens in the Name of the Rose, where they're trying to solve a murder or a series of murders in this
No.
medieval abbey. Um, and I think Eco's books, his fictional books, they always have a sense of playfulness about them. He's always playing with ideas in interesting ways and playing with signs and symbols and how they work. And it just has a depth to them, I think. And so it makes his fiction pretty compelling, even if someone is not interested at all in his semiotic theories. But he's a well-regarded semiotician, and his ideas still bear a lot of fruit, and he's a very important influence on current semioticians.
For sure, for sure. What do you think, Vince? Do you have a question or a question from the audience? I see a lot of, there's like a discussion on Schopenhauer. Why?
Yeah, I
don't
can't
know, but
follow it.
Schopenhauer seems to be very popular in the chat room, but whatever they want to do. But anything from you?
I can answer their I can answer their Schopenhauer questions too if they have
Okay, if you guys have any Schopenhauer, it's a lot of questions about will and connecting him to Plato. Yeah, I guess it's Wednesday night, huh?
I don't see any super chats though.
I think there was one, but without a question. But thank you. Yeah, thanks, Harry.
Yeah, he came and went. When I went to go talk to him, he was already gone. But
Okay.
and I thanked him. But yeah, I think what I'm hearing is I'm just sitting back and listening to all these auditory signs that are coming my way. And the one common theme I hear are minds, the mind, either an individual's mind or how different individuals' mind relate to each other and signal each other. Because without signals and signs and so forth, we couldn't trade ideas and communicate with each other. So really it's about minds and communication, I guess. And then as far as affecting the physical world, if I tell you go pick that up, you go pick it up. Well, I'm affecting the physical world, not directly, but by using language. So in a sense, almost everything is magic if you think about it that way. Unless there's some sort of supernatural world that we don't see, the unseen world, like radio waves. So what about that?
Yeah. So Peirce had this idea that all thoughts are signs, that they're connected in some way through the mind that is thinking them, and he had a term called the phaneron, which comes from a Greek word meaning to be present or to be manifest. That was referred to like all the signs that are present within someone's mind. So this could be, what's the current occupation of your thoughts, or it could be the sum total of your own knowledge and understanding. I talk a bit in the book about communication models, because that's something that's very important if we're going to talk about magic as communication, is to have a reasonable grounding in mundane theories of communication, how communications happen just in a broad sense. So some of the first kind of formal theories of communication were what you might call now a telementation, meaning that I have a thought in my mind, and then through the medium of language or the medium of writing or what have you, I transmit my thought into your mind. As it turns out, that's a bit too simplistic. And the reason it's too simplistic is because the word is not the thought. The word is an outer expression of the thought that's expressing certain things about the thought. Like if I talk about a tree, trees get used a lot as go-to signs in semiotics, especially semiotics of language. Yeah, if I talk about a tree, I'd say tree. I haven't said what kind of tree, how big it is, where it is, or anything else. You probably have an image of a particular kind of tree in your mind. Maybe it's a tree that's like, maybe you grew up on next to the woods and it was full of pines, and so you always think of pine when someone says tree, right? Or it could be something else, or it could be the tree that fell in your car yesterday. There's different. You might have a different conception of tree at different times depending on what's going on. So me just talking about a tree in the abstract doesn't tell you much. It talks about kind of the prototype of a tree, but it doesn't tell you about specific trees. And so your conception of that may be very different from mine. And so, and if I don't speak my conception of it, if I have a very specific tree in my mind, but I just say tree when we're talking, I haven't really conveyed my thought. I've conveyed part of my thought. I've conveyed an abstract, you know,
Like a
summary of my
form.
thought.
Plato, Plato's
Right,
forms.
right.
Archetypical tree.
Yeah, and so from there we can see that like the just saying that like I'm just transmitting my thoughts into your mind through the magic of language. That's not sufficient for most kinds of communication. Um, what I personally subscribe to, there are dozens of different types of communication theories. Some are applicable to certain situations. Some have other assumptions, etc. But the one that just for general use, like say two people just conversing, that I tend to subscribe to, is comes from what is called integrational linguistics. And what integrational linguistics stresses is the importance of context. So if let's say you and I are having a conversation, like we're having now, the things we're talking about kind of they carry some part of that context. If I start talking about, let's go back to our example of the bell, right? Well, we've been talking about bells and magic, so you're probably kind of thinking along those lines. And so there's a certain context that's conditioning what we think of when we're talking about bells right now. You're probably not thinking about like the big church bell because you probably don't have a big church bell in your ritual chamber. If you do, I want to come and hang out with earplugs because those things are loud. But if we just took the last couple of minutes of us talking and we wrote it out and handed it to someone that wasn't part of this conversation, wasn't aware of why, when, and how we were talking here, and then said, "Hey, what were these guys talking about? What does this mean? What's the significance of these things?" They would be missing something because they're missing part of the context that tells us what's happening here. Context also happens, like if you're, for those of you that may be cursed with office jobs, like you may be talking to your boss in a certain way that you wouldn't necessarily talk to like your best friend in that way. There's context that's there. There's the discrepancy in power that's part of the conversation. There's the fact that you depend on him not being offended by your conversation to make sure you have enough to live off of. You don't want to get fired, right? Or all these kind of things are part of the context that condition how you interpret the conversation. So a comment in that situation may mean something different than a comment between, you walking down the street and talking with your friend. So there's this importance of context is always there. But when you bring context into this in a big way, what you really discover is it's not that I have meaning and you have meaning. It's that we are creating meaning together as we talk. Because we're both contributing to it. We're both contributing to the conversation we're having. We're both contributing our own thoughts and the extent to which we are able to understand each other's thoughts and what the meaning behind those thoughts is, the intent behind them, the implications of them, etc. And that's kind of gone when you take it out of context. So taking that and now let's look at magic on top of that. If I say certain words within the ritual chamber, they may be the same or similar to words I might say in some other context, but I'm saying them here. Maybe I'm saying them in a different voice. I'm saying them wearing something different. It may just be about the situation I'm saying them in. Maybe you just walk in and start saying the words, after having kind of entered into whatever headspace you normally enter into for magical purposes. They take on meaning there they wouldn't have in another context. This is an idea out of anthropology. There was the Polish anthropologist Branislaw Malinowski spent years living among the Trobriand Islanders in the South Pacific, and at that time, anthropology viewed magic as erroneous type of thinking. Oh, they don't know science. They think they said the words and it rained, but we know it was just the clouds and seeding of the clouds, etc. And what he realized, which was a major breakthrough, and what was that within the context of these people's lives, magic did have a purpose. It wasn't that he wasn't just looking at them from the outside perspective, he was looking at it from an inside perspective as well. Because he had lived among them, he had been invited to participate in the things that they were doing. He'd been sort of accepted to an extent as someone they could share, the meaning of their culture with. And he was studying the language that they were using, and he was noticing the way that words get used within their magic that would be different from the way the same words would be used in a different context. And he surmised that part of what was happening with magic with them is that they were being transformed by the words because they were giving the words power in this situation that they did not expect the words to have in other situations. They brought something to the situation that says, all right, when I say this here, this is what I mean by this, and this is what
Intention. Yeah, they
exactly
had an
the intention.
intention.
They brought intention and context to it. And I find that to be a very persuasive idea. And that was continued by students of direct and indirect students of him, kind of expanded on that and bringing in other ideas from linguistics and from communication theory to an attempt to understand what magic was within certain contexts. And that idea that I build on in the book about that magic is a form of communication within that's given meaning within a context and then has certain effects as part of this conversation with the phenomenon that they were attempting to propitiate or to cause or to influence.
Yeah. But I think in order for something to be real magic, the way I think of it, there has to be no known explanation for how the effect came to be. I'll give you an example. I went to a party with a friend, and we were playing charades, and they were playing. So I turned to my friend and said, "You know what? Watch this." And so the person trying to enact the was the name of a movie, gave like one very small hint, and like very like and I just came out with the movie, and everybody went, whoa, whoa. There's no way no ordinary explanation for that could happen. Another time, I was um, I was in Hawaii, and we were going on the way to Captain Cook's Cove, and we wanted to go snorkeling, but it was raining, right? So we got there, and it was like a workshop, and the leader of the workshop, he thought he was a wise guy, says, Vance, why don't you make it not rain so we could go snorkeling? Because if it was raining, we weren't supposed to go snorkeling. So I said, okay. We got there, and I had my little ritual. I said, you know what? Weather gods, can you make it like not rain? They said, yeah, okay. And I swear to God, the clouds parted in a circle around this cove, and we went snorkeling for an hour. And so after that, we got in the thing. I don't know what they thought. He didn't react, and he said, all right, make it not rain on the way home. And I looked at him and said, no.
Yeah, drive through this.
Yeah. I mean, you're gonna
you burned
play
your
around
with
with
week
me.
too. Yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, now those things are real magic. A third thing is I was walking in Circus one day with a friend of mine who actually happened to be my manager, my boss, and we were talking about magical type of things, and he was kind of a skeptic. And I said, "Oh yeah, watch this." And so, you got a quarter? And so he gave me a quarter. I walked up to this slot machine. I put the quarter in, and nothing happened. And he said, "See, no, one more quarter." Gave me a quarter. I put it in, $300 jackpot. I knew the machine was going to pay off. That's magic. Now, convincing people to do things or whatever, I mean, it's interesting because the mind is mystery in itself, right? But there's difference between communicating between people and getting people to do things and so forth. But doing things where there's no way you could explain something had happened, that's magic to me.
No, that's definitely a very important component of it. I mean, that's why, for bigger things, right? Like say, like you're doing magic as part of trying to get a job, right? I often advocate that magic in most cases should not be the sole tool that you apply to a problem, but it should be one of the tools, right? Because you never know what tips the balance, right? Um, for example, like if you were trying to get a job, you would, if you only did a magical ritual related to the job, but never filled out an application, never went on an interview, right? You still could get a job, but the odds
Vance
are much
could.
lower, right? But if magic becomes one of the things that you employ as part of both magical and mundane work towards something, and that's the thing. I mean, in most situations, it doesn't matter how you got there, right? The result is what matters, right? Yeah, and I think that's why I think that's why it's very important to keep a magical diary. Again, we're back to communication and writing, right? And we lose sight of how magical writing is. You think about it, I'm making scratches on a dead piece of tree, and then hallucinating that there are words there later. That's magic by kind of any reasonable definition. We're just so jaded by its commonplace nature that we don't think of it anymore. Because in the ancient world, writing was a magical thing. Work with. I have an entire chapter in the languages of magic about runes. Not all uses of runes are magical by a long shot, but there are some that are. But the idea of writing itself was a magical thing. Especially when you think about the mythical origin of the runes, with Odin hanging on the tree for 9 nights and then winning knowledge of the runes. The idea that that he's literally writing reality into being by using the runes, which runes mean both mystery, but they later came to be associated with the symbols themselves as well. Because writing was a very rare skill until relatively recently in human history. Even in ancient societies we would think of as being highly literate, like ancient Greece. In ancient Greece, the literacy rate probably topped out at most 15% or so. And many of those were slaves, because they were the ones who were teaching the children of the rich and powerful. So they had to themselves know how to read and write in order to teach reading and writing to those people. But literacy is so widespread today, and we don't think about it because it's you don't notice the thing that's in your face every day. You don't notice it. It just doesn't stand out as being this weird thing, this magical thing that it is. But yeah, I mean, off on a tangent a bit, but that idea that that working with the tools at your disposal, and magic is one of those tools. In some situations, magic is a tool sufficient enough by itself, and some it works best in conjunction with other things.
Sure. No, I agree. Well, intelligence itself is magic, actually, when it comes down to it.
Yeah, there's so much that's inexplicable about it. I've known and had deep conversations with cognitive scientists, people that work in various disciplines that are pulled into cognitive science. And there's quite a lot that we know now about the functioning of the human brain and how it translates into the way that we think and approach certain things. But there's so much that's still inexplicable and probably will be forever. I definitely do not subscribe to the idea that the brain is just some sort of super advanced computer. There's clearly something else going on with that. Some of that comes out of when cognitive science as a discipline was starting to become a thing, which was in the 50s, which was the beginning of the computer age. And so it had some explanatory power for them then, that some of it has been borne out through later experimentation, but not all of it has.
Fascinating. Yeah, I've got some graphics here as we get towards the end. Of course, I want to show the audience. There is the book, The Language of Magic. So it's a wonderful journey. Yeah, there you go. I got my own copy too, as I showed the audience. And yeah, it's got everything: the history, the science, the anthropology, how cultures develop magic. And yes, as Toby says, the runes, symbols, all that good stuff. Then I added a little bit more myself. Maybe you want to talk to Toby, because some of the luminaries and saints of this particular show, we've got, of course, Philip K. Dick's famous quote. Can you guys read it, or am I? Oh yeah, there it is. Yeah, the basic tool for basic tool. Manipulation. The basic tool for the manipulation of reality is the manipulation of words. If you can control the meaning of words, you can control the people who must use them. So that's Philip K. Dick's famous one. Of course, he thought a dangerous magician was controlling the world and all that.
Yeah. Don't forget the woman manipulation of reality.
The mansplaining, the woman's manipulation of reality. Here we go. And then, of course, you're talking about hyperstition. And I love this quote by Terry Pratchett. Very simple. You need to believe in things that aren't true. How else can they become? Or even William Blake said, what was invented was once imagined. Airplane splitting the atom, like you were saying, all the things that scientifically we thought were impossible, somebody had to think about it and really think about it, right, Toby?
Absolutely.
Yeah, and along those same lines, kindred spirit with all of those, William Burroughs and paraphrasing of language is a virus. Language carries ideas along with it that are sometimes hidden beneath the surface. But it spreads throughout us. I mean, because that's one of the things is we feel compelled to talk even when there's nothing of substance to talk about. It's almost like the words are using us to spread themselves for their own reasons.
Yeah, exactly. Again, ideas have us, or even Richard Dawkins' idea of memes. Not how we know memes today, but these mind viruses that can just cross the world.
And I talk about that too, and because the meme is a very important idea. The idea we pick up something from others and we copy it, sometimes exactly, sometimes imperfectly, sometimes we add our own things to it. Memes kind of function, in a way sort of analogous to the way natural selection works. They become fit within a certain environment. It's worth passing on as an idea worth spreading, or sometimes they die on the vine and maybe you find it interesting, but the next person you say it to doesn't, and so it doesn't go anywhere.
Yeah, they mutate too, like the one with the cat and Cameron Diaz. I've seen so many versions.
That's the same mechanism, broadly speaking, as in DNA encoding and replication. The copies are not always perfect, and so variation comes out of that. Mutation is not the only way that change happens through genetics, but it's one of the primary ways. Again, because if the copies were perfect, then nothing would ever change. So you need some slight variation from time to time in order for things to evolve and to change.
Yeah, I mean, even in the chat, Toby, I think it was, a perfect example because they're talking about Schopenhauer. And of course, the word will is like a sticking point because it means differently than what Schopenhauer thought or Thelema thought, or the bro going to do leg day at the gym thinks will is, it's a word that has changed and has so many different contexts. So even when we meet at Schopenhauer, the word becomes really debated for a long time when Schopenhauer would have been like, no, I know what it means to me. So that right there is a perfect example of language. Well, awesome. Anything else you want to tell the audience about your book? I mean, this, of course, beyond being educational, will make you a better magician, won't it? This should help your magical practices.
That's the hope, and maybe it teaches you something about mundane communication too. We've mentioned a couple of things that I focus on in the book, runes, etc. But I wanted to kind of mention some of the other chapters.
Sure.
So I do spend a lot of time talking about different approaches to magic and sort of history of linguistics and semiotics and their ideas, but always kind of looking at how they can tell us something about magic. It's never just being like a dry textbook. But then I spend several chapters what I call case studies. So I spend one chapter where I look at the Greek magical papyri and a couple of selections from the Nag Hammadi library and talk about curse tablets, execration text, a few other things from the Mediterranean world. Then there's a chapter where I talk about runes as one tool that can be used as part of operative communicative communication in magic. And then I spend a chapter looking at different kind of schools and approaches to magic, school in the broad sense, not necessarily organizations. And I use Enochian and Sigils as kind of a connecting thread through some of those. So with Sigils, I talk a bit about Austin Osman Spare, I talk about chaos magic, I talk about the Topi, the Temple of Psychic Youth. With Enochian, I talk about the Golden Dawn, and I talk about Aleister Crowley and the Vision and the Voice, and then talk about the Church of Satan and the Temple of Set as well, with Enochian as kind of a connecting thread through those different approaches to it. And all of these case study chapters are looking at specific in-depth applications of the ideas developed in the rest of the book around semiotics and language and the way that those can be used as part of a magical practice. And it's hard how they can help us to understand magic in a deeper way. Because even though linguistics as a science is around 150 years old at this point, semiotics even a bit newer, at least in more formalized senses. But what I talk about throughout the book is that even though these are sort of new conceptions of these ideas and new terminology and systems of looking at ideas, they are implicit in so much that goes back. As I cover from execration texts, you were talking in the Old Kingdom in Egypt, so you're going back 2,000 years, give or take, even a little bit further before the Common Era, all the way to the present day. So it's covering like a huge swath of history
very
in
much.
the process. But looking at these are ideas that are implicit in magic all along.
Yes, and you do cover one of my all-time favorite texts, which I've done presentations, and that's Thunder Perfect Mind. Tell the audience
Yes.
about that. One of the most beautiful pieces of poetry, I think, in history.
Absolutely. It's a fantastic work. It's part of the Nag Hammadi library. It's a very it's usually kind of broadly lumped in with Gnostic literature, although it's a bit debatable, as is most of what is and isn't Gnostic,
Yeah.
or if Gnostic really exists as a category. But I don't get too much in that debate. But a couple things that I talk about a lot in the context of the Thunder Perfect Mind are the use of contradiction, of this the deity who's speaking through it, is describing the universe in these vast terms, these terms of opposites, of showing that truth is somewhere in the middle of these contradictions. And then I talk quite a bit about the idea of naming, about naming things into existence, which is a very old idea. You see it as far back even like Sumerian magical texts, and in various other places and different other cultures as well. The idea that by giving something a name, we give it some level of existence. We've thought it into being in a sense. Maybe it had an existence before that, but by having a name, a label that we attach to it, it becomes something new and different. And that also is part of the Thunder Perfect Mind, looking at it from the perspective of magical communication. But yeah, it's a beautiful, beautiful text as well. And I was very happy to kind of dig into that a bit. It was not actually part of my original plan for that chapter. I was originally going to look primarily at the Greek magical papyri and at curse tablets. But then I was speaking with a scholar friend of mine who specializes in that specific area, the Mediterranean world in the late antiquity. And he kind of sent me a reading list, which I'd asked him for, and he sent me a couple of articles that scholars who had kind of touched on some of these ideas in very specific and narrow ways. And one of them was talking about the text Thunder Perfect Mind, and it made me realize, oh wait, I need to write about that one as well. I was familiar with it before, but I just not thought about it as something to include in the book. But that was a very very satisfying part to write about, because it's just so rich in its symbolism and rich in the very specifically the way that language is used to convey certain ideas. Not just kind of stating or describing things, but the way that it's playing with language in order to give a deeper view of the universe from the perspective of the thunder, perfect mind.
Well said. Yeah, well said indeed. Yeah, so much in this book. He goes into Heidegger, which is always my mind always. One day I'll wrap my mind around Heidegger. Although I mean, if I know Parmenides, I think that should be enough. I think I can get Heidegger. I think Heidegger is just making secular Parmenides or Parmenides or whatever.
Yeah, bring in that and bring in the Anaxander fragment, and you're halfway there.
Yeah, there
Yeah,
you go. There you go. We all have different roads.
yeah. I focus specifically on Heidegger's kind of statement, language is the house of being, and I talk about what that means in terms of both what it means to be a self, but also what it means as language constructing and reflecting on the world.
Great, great. Well, awesome, audience. Yes, I highly recommend The Language of Magic. It's all there for the taking, all there to improve your language. God knows we need better communication in the year 2025. I can't believe I'm saying that, but so much for evolution, more like devolution, but it also will increase your magic. We are in a magical time. So this is the time to strike and really find your magic and your pathway and your will too. I'm just going to say that. So, yeah, we're at the end. Thanks for people at the audience. Again, thanks for those who support. And first I will say, Vance, thanks for keeping us company.
You bet. Always a pleasure.
Good
Okay,
deal.
thanks
Good
so
deal.
much for having me on. I've really enjoyed the conversation.
That was a
Very
blast.
interesting things to think about here.
Yes.
Oh,
I
yeah.
do have on the show notes.
Mhm.
I do have your website, but do you want to send people to your website or any other place right now, Toby?
What you have up there is fine, I think.
Okay. Well, then check out the show notes because he's got his website. Of course, his book can be found at all the usual suspects. You know who they are, whether you want it print, Kindle, and all that. So enjoy it. Yeah, check it out. And what are you working on next? Are you working on another book?
I am a bit early to kind of say specifically what direction it will go in, but um, going a bit more into some of the philosophical ideas I touch on in this book, and looking a bit more at uh, how we define ourselves through encountering other selves. So a bit less magical, more philosophical, but still very much in line with the ideas in this book.
Good deal. We'll look forward to it, and we hope that you pluck that one well out of the ether. I'm sure it's going to be great. But yeah, that's it. Everyone else, again, thank you. On Friday, we will have a show with Kevin Can. We will be discussing Platonic surrealism, and how to summon UFOs. It's going to be magical. So, but for now, we are done. As I always say, write your own gospel, live your own myth. Take care, everybody, and good night.